So we start with the first unit on definitions and models. When we dug into the concept of metacognition, the first scholar who has to be mentioned is James Flavel. James Flavel was an American researcher who did his work in the second half of the 20th century and who's apart from the development and in fact the proposition of the concept of metacognition, whose work was very influential because he translated the work of the famous Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget to the American people. So he translated the works of Piaget from French to English, or had them translated, and therefore that was the moment at which they were really read and used by the American world, cognitive psychologists in America. Okay, so Flavel was famous for his work on Piagetian concepts, but also because of his work on metacognition, which is of course related to this background in the cognitive development theory by Jean Piaget. As you can see here, the definition Flavel proposed is that metacognition is knowledge about and regulation of one's own cognitive activities in learning processes. So knowledge about knowledge, basically. Meta means about, as you know, in Greek. So we have physics as our knowledge about the physical world, and metaphysics, which is our knowledge about physics. So we have cognition, our knowledge about the world, and more in a sense of all our knowledge, not just the scientific or the science-oriented knowledge. And metacognition is then the knowledge about our knowledge. But what are we aware of? What do we know about the world, or what do we not know, etc. So all these things. Regulation is also already in the definition by Flavel. So knowledge is perhaps more the declarative part of metacognition, declarative knowledge, as I mean. But apart from that, we also have the procedural knowledge, and that's the regulation, that are the skills and strategies people use to carry out cognitive tasks. So we have, on the one hand, the knowledge about cognition, about cognitive tasks, and about our knowledge, and on the other hand we have the skills and strategies, which may also be defined as procedural knowledge, or self-regulated behavior, or self-regulation or regulation of cognitive tasks. Okay. So this was the definition in 1979, and Zimmermann proposed in 2002, together with his colleagues, a definition of metacognition which has a more dynamic character and perhaps is more goal-oriented as well. The definition is self-generated thoughts, feelings, and behaviors oriented to attaining goals. So here we have, let's say, a more encompassing definition, which also includes motivational, let's say, variables like feelings and emotions, etc., and motivations. So this makes the concept a larger concept in which various, let's say, variables are included. Okay, let's compare the two models. The model which was developed originally by Zimmermann and Campillo, which is, of course, a sort of, a graphical representation of what Zimmermann considered as the essential characteristics of metacognition and self-regulation, on the one hand, and the model by Nelson and Ahrens, on the other hand, the second one here. So first, the model by Zimmermann and Campillo. As you can see, we have here three phases, and these three phases, let's say, cover the execution of cognitive tasks. First, we have the forethought phase, then the actual performance of the cognitive task, and then we have the self-reflection phase afterwards. The forethought phase precedes task execution and has to do with goal setting, with strategic planning. So all kinds of metacognitive activities. So we do have to set goals before we start to carry out a particular task. We do have to, let's say, plan our strategies in order to attain the goals. Definitely metacognitive skills and strategies we are talking about. But Zimmerman and Campillo also include, let's say, more motivation-related variables like self-efficacy beliefs, the beliefs you have about how successful you will be in performing a particular task. The expectations about the outcome. How do you think you are going to perform? What level do you set for the results you are going to achieve? Your interest into the task, how much value do you give to the task, and how important it is for you, and then also whether you want to learn basically during task execution, or whether you want to perform. Let's say whether you want to show your results or to earn your grades, or to show to other people that you are capable of completing the task. So that's what we call the performance goal orientation, as distinct from the learning goal orientation. Okay, all these variables are relevant for the preparation phase, the forethought phase, the thinking about the task phase before actually carrying out a task. Then we enter the performance phase, and there we are the learner is controlling his behavior and is also observing his behavior. Controlling by, for instance, imagery, by forming a mental picture of the task as it is executed, and by keeping, let's say, all kinds of variables in order to understand how far task execution has been proceeded. By instructing himself or herself how to continue, by focusing attention on particular aspects which need attention, and by adopting task strategies which are in fact relevant for the particular task and the goals which have to be achieved. Apart from this controlling part in the performance phase, there is also the observation part, in which students record their progress, and in which they also perhaps do some experiments, whether to find out which avenue is more beneficial for task completion, stepping aside and carrying out particular experiments to find out what should be done in this particular phase of the task execution. After task execution, you end up with self-reflection. So you look back on how you performed, whether you met your goals, and to what extent you met your goals, whether your success and failure were caused by internal causes, your own effort or your own strategies, available strategies, or external causes, the quality of the instruction or the materials or whatever. Okay, and there is also an affective part again, whether you feel satisfied, whether you feel happy about task completion, and whether you adapt it to the environment in a sort of constructive way, or whether you in fact were rather defensive while completing the task. So these again are motivational variables, as we also saw in the forethought phase. There you also see these motivational variables, which are in Zimmerman's idea part of the concept of self-regulation, or the concept of metacognition. Okay, now we discussed the model by Nelson and Narens. What you might say is that this model is in fact an elaboration of the performance phase in the model by Zimmerman and Campillo. As you see here, we have the control and observation activities, and here we have the control and monitoring activities. Controlling the task performance and monitoring the task performance by collecting all kinds of data about the progress being made, etc. Okay, so these two activities, controlling and monitoring, you see both in the model by Nelson and Narens and also in the model by Zimmerman and Campillo. Here termed control, self-control and self-observation. There's a more fundamental aspect in Nelson's model, and that's a distinction between meta and object level. The object level is the level of the task execution, and the meta level is the supervision level. So you might think of somebody carrying out a task, and in his head there is some sort of homunculus, keeping an eye on task execution, and if necessary, let's say, is controlling task execution, changing it in order to arrive at the goals which were set beforehand. In order to be able to do that, this homunculus needs a sort of representation of the task as it is being carried out. And that is the object level mode sort of, ellipse as you see it at the meta level. So at the meta level, there is a representation of the task being executed at the object level. Influencing task execution goes through the control arrow, and collecting data about task execution that happens through the monitoring arrow. So the monitoring arrow collects data which are stored in the object level mode, the representation of the task, and from this representation controlling instructions are sent to the task level. Okay? So this is a very fundamental sort of model, I think, and it is relevant in many situations in which cognitive tasks are being executed. You might even, let's say, implement it in organizations where you have these various levels. Okay, then we have the discussion which was in fact raised by Marcel Veenman and Jan Elshout, his promoter, whether metacognition and intelligence are in fact one and the same concept. You can imagine that intellectual ability, the ability to perform tasks which are, in fact, as it was originally developed, the whole concept of intelligence, which are carried out at school, so school tasks. Are you able to succeed in school tasks? That is the original meaning of the concept of intelligence, as it was raised by Alfred Binet in Paris in 1900. Okay, so the ability to complete tasks in school might be defined, is in fact the definition of intelligence, but you can say that metacognition in fact has the same meaning. So are these two concepts one and the same? What Marcel Veenman did, he asked people to carry out cognitive tasks whilst thinking aloud. So they were actually reading a text, for instance, and said, okay, I'm going to start to read the first page. I look into the title. I just briefly check the size of the paper, and I look into the subtitles and the headers of the paragraphs, etc. And then I start reading. So this is sort of orientation activity, which is definitely a metacognitive activity. So in this way, Marcel Veenman collected data about the way the meta level, in fact, was controlling the object level in terms of Nelson and Arendt's model. And in this way, he could make an estimate of the metacognitive skillfulness of a subject, of a participant carrying out a task. So he had independent measures of their metacognitive skillfulness and their intellectual ability through an intelligence test, and he could compare the two indicators and see whether they were completely correlated, or let's say at a very high level, or whether they were independent, perhaps, so had a zero correlation. Well, there was, of course, a substantial correlation between the two abilities, the intellectual ability and the metacognitive ability. But more importantly, there was also a distinct contribution by both variables to cognitive performance, which is to say that people with a high intelligence score were successful, people with a moderate intelligence score but a high metacognitive skillfulness score were also successful, and people with a high metacognitive skillfulness score and a moderate intelligence score were also successful. So we do have separate concepts, and the interesting thing, of course, is that intellectual ability is very difficult to influence, but metacognitive skillfulness is in fact can be trained. So you can train children in school to carry out cognitive tasks orderly, by planning, by executing, and by evaluating, etc. By all kinds of, these kinds of metacognitive activities. Okay, that's the positive side of it, but there is also some warning here. People with a high intellectual ability, they may get, so to speak, a little bit lazy as far as the development of metacognitive abilities is concerned, because they don't need them to be successful. Particularly boys in secondary education, they suffer from this, let's say, problem, because they are able to complete their assignments based only on their high intellectual ability. So they don't need, these planning activities, etc., etc. So, and they don't develop the planning skills and the orientation skills and evaluation skills, let's say the self-regulation skills. They simply do not develop them because they don't need them in the context of secondary education. But when they enter further education, for instance, the university, there they definitely do need these metacognitive skills. And when they do not have developed these skills, they may run into trouble, and often do run into trouble, these, let's say, high ability boys, because they simply were not in a position to develop the skills they needed in university education. Okay, so that's about metacognition and intelligence. I think we have now gone into some detail about definitions and models, the first unit of this module.